Okay, friends, we're in chapters 29 and 30 of the book of Exodus. And can I be frank? This week's readings have been a bit of a slog. I mean, come on. There's no burning bush that we've read about in the last 5 days, no parting of the Red Sea, no God delivering the 10 Commandments. No, what we've had this week, honestly, it hasn't been the most exciting reading in the Bible. So I want to congratulate you for sticking with it. Because though the reading is dry, there's a point to the seemingly endless detailed description that we've been reading about in this that pertains to this traveling sanctuary. Today we hear a detailed description for the priests or pastors of that traveling sanctuary God is having them construct. We hear what the priests should be doing and how they should conduct themselves, and it's caused me to stop and wonder, why? Why priests and pastors in the first place? Are they really all that important? Because when I read all of this, it sometimes feels like a big waste of resources. Hey crew, in chapters 29 and 30 of the book of Exodus, we get detailed instructions for the priests and the pastors who would be overseeing God's traveling sanctuary or tabernacle. We hear how they should be consecrated as priests and how they should oversee the life of the temple. The priests were to ensure that the temple, if you will, was a place where sacrifices and offerings were presented, and it was the priesthood who would make sure this all happened in an orderly manner in this traveling sanctuary. Now, some of you might say, why did they need priests? I know I sure did when I first read this. Is this all necessary? I mean, couldn't anyone do this? Why all the ornate clothing, all the pomp and circumstance? To our modern sensibility, come on. This all seems like a foolish use of resources out in the wilderness. What's the need for these priests? Well, first off, I think God knew something. He knew that just like us, those Israelites, they weren't going to have a lot of spare time out there in the wilderness. There was sort of a practical need for someone to oversee the life of this traveling sanctuary. Remember, they're traveling out in the wilderness. Every day, they would begin their day by gathering food for their family. Then they'd break camp, pack everything up. Then they'd travel by foot all day long. When they reached their destination for the night, they set up camp, gathered firewood, gathered food for their family. They cooked, they cleaned up, and then they'd head to bed only to start it all over the next morning. They were busy out in the wilderness, just like you and me. And so in order to keep the traveling sanctuary central to their community, they needed intentionality. Practically speaking, they needed someone tending to it. Here's what else I think God knew. God knew the Israelites would need reminders of God's promises. You see, we've already talked about how God's people, they grumbled again and again to Moses because, and here's why, they couldn't connect the dots between their current struggles and God's ultimate promise of that land of Canaan. The priests are to be the ones continually reminding the Israelites of God's promise, that God would be faithful whatever they would face. And finally, and maybe most importantly, God knew that people are important to us humans. As humans, people are important to us. It's through people that we find real meaning, we find real purpose, we find real joy in life. And God didn't want to be known in abstraction as some being drifting up in the sky. God knew that people mattered and so created a unique role, the priest. People through whom others would come to know about this God. Priests were to be, if you will, fleshy reminders of God's presence. They would be people always pointing the Israelites to God in tangible, human, earthy ways. Now hear me. These priests were in no way sort of like little gods, not at all. Rather, they're people called by God to point others to God, a God who makes promises, somebody who reminds them of God's desires, God's promises, encourages the Israelites in their walk with God, and was the one who would prepare them for life as God's chosen people in Canaan. Now, today, I don't have to tell you that the reputation of priests and pastors it's sort of tarnished. Over the past 25 years, the only time priests or pastors seem to make the news is when a financial, sexual leadership scandal breaks. Priests and pastors have also not always seen themselves as people who are meant to be tangible, relevant tools of God, people called to speak the language of the people in ways people can relate to. I mean, you know this. Far too often, pastors, priests, they see themselves as set apart, as holy, and they speak this weird theological language nobody can understand. They make worship irrelevant and, worse yet, boring. So today, as we close, what has your experience been like with priests or pastors? And how could we pastors do a better job of pointing people to God in ways that are tangible and relevant? And here's what I want you to do. When you answer this second question, send me your answer. I'm always looking to be a better pastor for those who call this church their church home. Folks, thanks for tuning in today. Have a good one.